Good morning on a special Sunday, a Sunday that finds Catholics the world over mourning, along with the rest of us, the death of a pope. I'm Anthony Mason at CBS News World Headquarters in New York with special coverage of the death of Pope John Paul II. At the Vatican, the official 9-day period of mourning has begun with ceremonies of prayer and contemplation. Correspondent John Roberts is in Rome this morning with the latest. Good morning, John.
Good morning to you, Anthony. Actually, good afternoon. It's 1 o'clock here in Rome, about halfway through the first of the 9 official days of mourning after the death of Pope John Paul II in his Vatican apartment last night at 9:37 p.m. Italian time. It has been quite a scene this morning at St. Peter's Square after the square last night was filled with more than 100,000 people. Tens of thousands more attended mid-morning Mass, the first of many funeral masses to occur over the next 9 days of mourning, led by Cardinal Angelo Sodano, who was, up until the Pope's death last night, the Secretary of State, but according to the Apostolic Constitution, now becomes just a regular cardinal. Tens of thousands of people from across the city of Rome came this morning to this ceremony to celebrate Mass for the Pope, to say a final farewell to the man who they both admired and loved. He was so well known here in Rome because he had visited just about every church that exists in Rome, and they count more than 1,000. A little while ago, in the Apostolic Palace in the Sala Clementina, several senior Vatican officials as well as Italian officials came by to pay their initial respects to the Pope, who was lying in repose in the Sala Clementina. Beginning a little after noon tomorrow, the Pope will lie in state at the St. Peter's Basilica, where people will be allowed, the public will be allowed to come in and view the body and pay their respects. The body will be taken away this afternoon, as best we can tell, for preparation for burial. And it's interesting to note that in this process, which is so steeped in tradition, with rare exception, it is the same Italian family that has been responsible for preparing the Pope for burial. He will lie in state for another 2 to 3 days, still to be decided the exact date and time of his funeral. Pope John Paul II called for it to be between 4 and 6 days after his death, which would make that sometime between Wednesday and Thursday. Also unknown at this point, because his last will and testament has not been opened and read, is where the Pope wants to be buried. In his Apostolic Constitution, he seemed to give some indication that it would be up to Vatican officials to make that decision, but there's also been some speculation that he may want to go home to Krakow, which was his first parish that he served the Catholic Church in. And Anthony, the next big event after the Pope's funeral will be, of course, the beginning of the conclave, when 117 cardinal electors will gather at the Sistine Chapel to decide who the successor to Pope John Paul II will be. Anthony?
John Roberts in Rome, thanks. All this morning, along with my colleague Russ Mitchell, we're going to be looking back on the life and accomplishments of this remarkable Pope and looking ahead to the age-old process that will choose his successor. Russ?
Good morning, Anthony. Good to be with you today. For the faithful who crowded St. Peter's Square these past several days, the official announcement of John Paul's passing marked the end of a long and determined vigil. Alan Pizzi is in Rome with that part of the story. Alan, good morning. Alan Pizzi getting ready there, getting mic'd up. Alan, can you hear me now? Okay. We'll try to get back to Alan in just a couple of moments. Let's move on for right now, Anthony.
Thanks, Russ. We'll go back to Alan Pizzi in Rome in a moment. The trying emotions of the day were felt far from the columns of St. Peter's Square by Catholics and non-Catholics alike. Bob McNamara is in Chicago with the proof of that. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning. Well, with a Polish-American population in the hundreds of thousands here, Chicago really was Pope John Paul's kind of town. But in houses of worship all across this city, they will be remembering a Pope they got to know so well. At Five Holy Martyrs Catholic Church, the somber bell and the shroud told a Chicago neighborhood Pope John Paul II was gone. Chester Rybach.
I don't think there'll be another pope like him. Everybody loved him. Catholic, Protestant, everybody loved the man.
In a nearby Polish restaurant, customers teared up at the television coverage. Agnes Nunez.
The color of the skin, the countries, poor, rich, handicapped, he was there for everybody, and I don't know how gonna be. It's not gonna be the same.
Father Gerald Grubczynski, pastor of the predominantly Polish-American Five Holy Martyrs Catholic Church, says there's been a death in the family.
We're going to have this great sense of loss when he leaves, that, where do we go from here? And I think that that's possibly why people are so upset and so feeling so badly about this.
And as Chicago mourned, so did official Washington.
The Catholic Church has lost its shepherd. The world has lost a champion of human freedom. And a good and faithful servant of God has been called home.
Former President Clinton remembered John Paul as stubborn.
Yeah, he was stubborn, but probably he should have been stubborn as the leader of a great faith. He was also a reconciler, though. He was uncompromising in his own beliefs, but he respected others if he thought they shared his fundamental values.
Back in Chicago, John Paul II is remembered by the lives he personally touched. Carl Hagenhuber, a boyhood friend of the Pope, says he was stunned when his friend was elected to lead the church.
I know how to explain it, but I got so emotional that I cried, and I have the same feeling today.
But no one may have been blessed by the Pope's 1979 visit to Chicago like a 9-year-old boy who'd lost his arms and legs to a rare blood disease. Today, Bob Lujano enjoys his wheelchair rugby team and a life inspired by his brief brush with the Pope.
And it just, makes me feel sad at times that we're going to lose him or that we've lost him. But it also just brings me back to those moments going through the struggle I had to go through, and to know that I was going to persevere and I was going to survive, no matter how serious the situation was.
One city touched by one man and magnified millions of times across the country today. Bob McNamara, CBS News, Chicago.
Returning to our continuing story of the morning, once John Paul left Poland for the Vatican, he belonged to all the world. Our early show colleague Harry Smith looks back on a life of service with few equals.
The memories will be everlasting. Pope John Paul II, a man of God, a man of the people. Papal biographer Carl Bernstein.
He's one of the great figures of the century. He has had an effect on our time as few individuals have.
Though he was the spiritual leader of the world's 1 billion Roman Catholics, Pope John Paul II saw all of humanity as his flock. Newsweek's Vatican correspondent Robert Blair Kaiser.
He has really gone around the world encouraging the prime ministers and the presidents and the kings and the elite in every nation to make a more peaceful world. He's one of the greatest popes of all time.
Above all, he was a man who believed in the power of faith, who saw evidence in his own life of the hand of God. He saw his homeland survive the ravages of Hitler and Stalin, while he himself survived an assassin's bullet. Former U.S. Ambassador to the Vatican, Raymond Flynn.
This man has had an extraordinary experience living under dictatorships and oppression and discrimination and persecution of the Catholic faith. And that's why he's such a man of extraordinary courage and strength.
By embracing celibacy in the context of the priesthood,
John Paul II was a man of strict religious orthodoxy, unyielding on birth control, abortion, celibacy, and women in the priesthood. His methods for spreading his message, though, were new and different, and maybe a bit unorthodox.
In the name of the
But they seemed to be just what the church needed. At a time when some lamented the death of religion, the Pope seemed to be a one-man revival. Pope John Paul II traveled where no pope had ever been. Everywhere he went, he drew thousands to him. Tens of thousands. Hundreds of thousands. Pope John Paul II was a charismatic figure, very much in the mold of the Church's founders. Church historian Monsignor Timothy Dolan.
What John Paul II has done is return the papacy to its first century roots. In other words, he wants to be what Peter was at the beginning. Not all that concerned about managerial things, more concerned about bringing the message of Christ to the whole world.
At a time when celebrities were worshipped with almost religious fervor, the Holy Father was perhaps the biggest celebrity of them all, the most recognized man in the world. He was seen as a modern-day superstar, cheered like the ultimate rock idol, and he appealed like no pope before him to the youth of the world.
John Paul II, he loves you.
In 1979, he paid his first visit as Pope to New York City, leading a Mass at Madison Square Garden.
20,000 raving teenagers were there waiting for the Pope to come in. He came in a Jeep, open car. He looked like a heavyweight champion boxer. He looked like Rocky. He was going like this with his hands, thumbs up, and encouraging the kids to cheer. I think that was the first moment that he realized that the kids were a great place for him to carry the Christian message.
It was hard to see evidence in his own youth of the man that he would become. Pope John Paul II was born Karol Józef Wojtyła on May 18, 1920, in the small Polish town of Wadowice. He was the son of a military officer. Growing up in heavily Catholic Poland, he was an avid athlete, an excellent student, and an altar boy. But young Karol didn't seem destined for a life in sacramental robes. He seemed headed for a life in academia, or a life in the theater.
When he graduated from high school, he was the valedictorian of the class, and the Archbishop was so impressed with his speech and his record, his accomplishment in school, he invited him to become a priest. He didn't want to. He wanted to be an actor.
But then the Nazis invaded Poland. Everything changed for Poland, for Karol Wojtyła. Friends and fellow actors were arrested and sent to Auschwitz. Karol himself was picked up, but was released because he worked in a quarry, a vital industry. Everything that he knew was being destroyed. He turned to his faith for solace. And in 1942, he enrolled in an underground seminary, studying to be a priest. In 1946, he was ordained. By then, the occupying army of the Nazis had been replaced by the Russians, one totalitarian and godless ideology replaced by another. And Karol Wojtyła, named the Archbishop in Krakow in 1963, and a cardinal 4 years later, learned to deftly maneuver in a country whose leaders wanted nothing more than to destroy the church and extinguish the faith. It was a lesson he never forgot. In August 1978, an Italian cardinal was installed as pope, taking the name John Paul I, but he died after only 33 days as pontiff. When the College of Cardinals reconvened that October to elect a successor, everyone expected that another Italian would become the 264th pope. After all, there hadn't been a non-Italian pope in nearly 500 years. But the College of Cardinals was deadlocked, none of the favorites able to capture a majority. The Cardinals then turned to 58-year-old Karol Wojtyła, the man who would become John Paul II, the first Polish pope in history.
It almost seemed from the beginning that what the church, what the College of Cardinals was saying is, we're not going to do business as usual. There's going to be something different. There's going to be something bold. There's going to be something daring about this new pope.
What was perhaps most daring about this new pope was not what he did in the realm of the sacred, but rather what he did in the realm of the secular, fighting to free his homeland and the rest of the world from the shackles of communism.
He is pivotal in understanding the fall of communism. He said communism at some point was going to implode on its own accord. He says the tree was rotten, I just gave it a good shake.
In 1979, he convinced the communist leaders of Poland to allow him to visit his homeland.
He got very close to really kind of urging revolution without actually doing so. Came as close as he could without really starting a riot.
Gorbachev said to me, the one big mistake of communism was allowing Pope John Paul II to come to Poland right after he was elected Pope. Because once he came to Poland, it just united the people of Poland.
By 1989, Poland's communist regime had been toppled, and soon throughout Europe, communism was gone. And where it remained, the Pope went there too. He was the first Pope ever to go to Cuba.
I am confident, Mr. President.
Everywhere he went, he used the power of his position and the power of his personality to spread his beliefs.
To serve the whole of humanity. My dear brothers and sisters in the black community,
that despite seeming divisions, we are all one, all responsible for our fellow man.
We cannot stand idly by when thousands of human beings are dying of hunger.
And he admitted that his own church was guilty of wrongdoing.
I think it's one of the most revolutionary things that he did. On March the 12th, the year 2000, he issued his famous mea culpa.
Per l'uso della violenza che alcuni di essi hanno fatto.
That day, there was a ceremony to ask forgiveness for the Crusades, for forced conversions, for all the sins of the Church. He was a pope who asked forgiveness and was also willing to forgive. On May 13, 1981, John Paul II was the target of an assassin's bullet shot in St. Peter's Square by Mehmet Ali Aja. The Pope was severely wounded, but he survived. The Pope never completely recovered from his wounds, and although his health deteriorated in later years and the effects of Parkinson's disease were often apparent, he continued to be the Pope he had always been. To travel, to build bridges between people, to try to heal the wounds in his own church. Near the end of his papacy, an ailing and weakened John Paul summoned the leadership of the United States Church to the Vatican for an unprecedented emergency meeting to confront the scandal over pedophiles in the priesthood. Pedophilia is not only a sin, the Pope said, but a crime, and he added, there is no place in the Church for those who harm the young. To the end, Pope John Paul II was determined to leave the world a better place than he found it.
Who fills his shoes? It's cliche, they're big shoes to fill. That is going to be a very, very difficult role for somebody to assume. It's going to take a unique man, just like Karol Wojtyła.
You're talking about a man who presided over the church at a time of startling, almost dynamite-type impact. Boy, I think he deserves the term John Paul the Great, certainly.
I think John Paul II the Good might be more appropriate for him. John Paul II brought goodness to areas of the world that were starving for peace and justice. That's what he did.
Whether he's remembered as Pope John Paul the Great or John Paul the Good, there is no doubt that he will always be remembered. In the end, his life will be his enduring legacy. Karol Józef Wojtyła, a man of his time, a pope for the ages.
Correspondent Harry Smith. Nowhere is the grief and sense of personal loss greater than in Pope John Paul's native Poland. Elizabeth Palmer is with us in Krakow this morning. Good morning, Elizabeth.
Good morning. Yes, I'm in Krakow, which is a beautiful medieval city. This is where the Pope was before he became Pope, the Archbishop. It's lunchtime now and people have filled the main town square where I'm standing, filled the cafes. It's a lovely spring day. They've trickled here to talk and reminisce, having been to one of the countless church services all over the city this morning.
For the first time in a quarter of a century, Poles worship Sunday Mass in churches no longer headed by a Polish pope. They mourn the loss of the former parish priest, Karol Wojtyła, not only the Holy Father in Rome, but also countryman, spiritual guide, and anti-communist hero. The reading this morning, the story of doubting Thomas, the apostle, a message to these people that the painful loss of John Paul II should not shake their faith.
Because he was very important for us, because he cared for us a lot, and he prayed for us, and he really wanted us to follow God. And
we all should pray for him, and I'm going to pray a little bit here.
The sad news came last night and dominated the headlines today. As people read the stories and the tributes, each was in a private world of personal memories, as the Pope was a friend and colleague to many here, and also a revered member of the national family.
Because I love Papa.
What you really get here in Poland is a sense of the Pope as a human being, multi-dimensional, multi-talented, with enormous charisma. He was a poet. He loved the outdoors. People that we've met went hiking and skiing and kayaking with him. And they remember, of course, his political activities, that he was a skilled politician. He knew how to weave his way without seeking confrontation with the communists when he was here. And then the great moment when he galvanized the Polish people and made them believe that they could defeat the communist government that they had suffered under since the end of the Second World War. In fact, somebody said to us yesterday, when the Pope helped us defeat the communist government, that was the moment the war ended for us. And for that, as much as any of his great spiritual leadership qualities, he is beloved and revered. Anthony?
Elizabeth Palmer in Krakow, Poland this morning. Thanks. There is other news this morning alongside the passing of John Paul II, and Russ has more on that. Russ?
That is right, Anthony. The Iraqi parliament chose a Sunni Arab as its new speaker today, 2 months after the country's first free elections. And just hours earlier, insurgents attacked U.S. forces at the notorious Abu Ghraib prison. Now, Byron Pitts joined us live from Baghdad with more on that. Byron, let's begin with the attack this morning. What happened?
Well, good morning, Russ. It happened at about sunset Saturday evening here. The insurgents hit the Abu Ghraib prison with not one but two suicide car bombers. Afterwards, RPGs and small arms fire. It lasted for about 45 minutes. When it was over, 44 American soldiers and Marines were injured, 12 insurgents were injured, and at least one killed. According to the U.S. military, the insurgents were trying to break out of the facility. A number of detainees controlled in a part of the prison maintained by the Iraqi military. They failed. And Russ, as you said, Abu Ghraib is the scene of that prisoner abuse scandal nearly a year ago. So Abu Ghraib remains a sore spot and a major target 1 year later.
Okay.
Russ?
Okay, Byron Pitts in Baghdad. We will speak to you later throughout the morning. You are watching CBS News continuing coverage of the death of Pope John Paul II.
For more on the meaning of the life of Pope John Paul II, we're joined by Father Michael Russo, professor of communications at St. Mary's College of California. Good morning, Father.
And good morning, Anthony.
We were talking a little while ago, and you were saying one of the things that struck you particularly about this Pope was that he was also a very effective pastor.
Precisely. If there's a job description for priest or pope, it's be a good pastor. Celebrate sacraments with people. Be there for people, witness to their lives. The remarkable thing about John Paul was that he was actually able, as Bishop of Rome, to go into the city and go to parishes. That may seem remarkable. You would think popes would do that, but in fact, they did not until John Paul. He was able to get into the people's lives on a person-to-person, heart-to-heart basis.
When you look at this Pope and the way he was able to use the media, was this Pope, as we look back, the most effective user of the media?
Well, he certainly took the news of religion from the back page to the front page. Today's New York Times, full banner headline. I think he used the media in unique ways. I think in many ways his ministry to the globe, so much traveling, so much headlines, it's actually something that was kind of intentional. I mean, he knew what he was doing. One of the difficulties, of course, is that he presented this large image, but it's for the rest of us in the trenches to kind of deal with the details. And between here and there, you know, you have to work that out. And bishops and priests and qualified laity have to deal with the everyday working of a Catholic ministry to one another and to the world.
To what degree do you think the choice of the next Pope will be a reflection or a reaction to this Pope?
Well, a little like politics, you know, in effect, you know, President Bush is not President Clinton. And you always have this little bit of pendulum. Clearly the men, the 117 cardinals who now have to make this decision, have been considering this for quite a while. I mean, the past 5 years of this papacy have been drawing to a close. The last few weeks, last few months, this has been on their mind. It's a momentous decision. This past week, I was with a group of individuals, all of whom were going to be welcoming Keith O'Brien, the cardinal from Edinburgh, Scotland, to California. He did not come because of this situation. All of us who were invited to this gathering said to one another, this is kind of remarkable to know one of the 117 are going to make this decision.
Sure.
And many of these people knew him well and from childhood. So all of us, I think, are looking to a graced moment, because I think there's an opening for an opportunity for the Spirit to work.
It's interesting, Anthony and I were talking about this on Friday. I think, Father Russo, we discussed it yesterday as well. Pope John Paul appointed all but 3 of the people who will elect the next Pope. I mean, how much of a hand did he have in choosing the next Pope?
Well, in fact, certainly his memory is revered, that's clear. But, you know, there's these little grace notes. They recognize that there are needs around the world that have to be paid attention to. And clearly, the next Pope will have to be able to reach out. Certainly will have to be a person who has some command of language, some command of the everyday administration of the church, some command of the person-to-person, heart-to-heart. I do think, however, going back to the point I was making earlier, he has to be a supreme pastor. He must be an individual who's going to touch the hearts and minds of people around the world, Catholic or not. And this man has. So they're difficult shoes to fill, but there's someone among these 117 who's going to come forward and set a new agenda, open up new doors. The word pontiff means bridge, pons pontis in Latin, and to make those bridges between people, particularly in this world, so conflicted, with war going on, with the situation in Africa and AIDS, this Pope a new Pope can make a big difference.
And the church has changed a lot. I mean, he was the first, Pope John Paul II was the first non-Italian in 450 years.
Absolutely.
Are we likely to get the first non-European? Is that a possibility?
Possible. I think if you look at the card of candidates, it's divided between the Italians and I think the Spanish-speaking candidates.
All right. Father Russo, thanks very much.
Thank you, Father.
CBS News coverage of the death of John Paul II continues. watching CBS News continuing coverage of the death of John Paul II. I'm Anthony Mason in New York. Good morning. Fewer than 24 hours have passed since the official announcement of John Paul's death, but already at the Vatican, the process of official mourning and papal transition is well underway. We go back to John Roberts in Rome for the latest. John?
Good day to you, Anthony. Just a short time ago, some senior members of the Vatican staff, as well as some Italian dignitaries, were afforded an opportunity to pay respects to the Pope as he lay in repose in the Sala Clementina in the Apostolic Palace. The Pope was dressed in crimson papal vestments, as well as adorned with the papal seal. He will be there just for this afternoon. Then his body will be prepared for burial tomorrow, shortly after noon Italian time. He will lie in state at St. Peter's Basilica, where the public will be invited. The public, not just here in Rome, but around the world, will be invited to come and pay their last respects. Italian authorities are expecting up to 2 million people to come over the next few days to see John Paul II lying in repose. They have made enormous preparations, including erecting tents on the outskirts of the city to give the pilgrims who they expect will make the journey here a place to stay. Also tomorrow will begin the first of many of the so-called general congregations that precede the conclave to choose the next pope. The College of Cardinals will get together. They will discuss where they think the future of the church will go and other church business. And then on or about April 17th, they will ensconce themselves in the Sistine Chapel conclave, which means with key, conclave, to talk about who they think should be the successor to John Paul II. Russ?
Okay. John Roberts in Rome, thanks a lot. For the faithful who crowded St. Peter's Square these past several days, the official announcement of John Paul's passing marked the end of a long and determined vigil. Alan Pizzi is in Rome with that part of the story. Alan, good afternoon to you.
Russ, good afternoon. Well, it was clear that the end of the third longest papacy in the history of the Catholic Church was approaching when John Paul II couldn't speak throughout Easter week, but the countdown really began on Thursday, when he was hospitalized with septic shock and a fever. As word of that came out, people began to gather in St. Peter's Square waiting for him to appear again, but of course he wasn't going to, and the news coming out just kept getting worse and worse. The fever was going up, his heart rate was bad, his blood pressure was falling. By Friday night, there were up to 70,000 people packed into St. Peter's Square, saying the rosary, doing a requiem mass for him. Not a requiem mass, but doing a mass for him. When the word reached the Pope that many of those people out there were young people, he tried very hard to speak, and the aides, his cardinal, said that they interpreted what he said as being thank you for coming, basically. John Paul II had all reached out to the youth. Cardinals who saw the Pope lying in his state, in his bedroom, said that he was serene, facing death in a very serene way, and that he was lucid. In fact, the Vatican spokesman was at pains to say that John Paul II never fell into a coma. But when he died, the bells began to toll long after the faithful knew, and people just came to pay their respects and to see this wonderfully historic figure. And from now on, right through till the funeral, we're just going to see more and more people there praying and just coming for what is the end of an incredible era. Russ?
Alan, throughout the course of the day yesterday, of course the last couple days actually, it's been a roller coaster, I imagine, for folks there. Can you kind of go through the various moods of the faithful there at St. Peter's over the past 24 to 48 hours?
Well, you know, people have been sometimes hopeful, but mostly resigned. There was a lot of people saying, look, we know it's going to happen. We're just here to share this last moment with him, to pay our respects. The cardinals who saw him said that they were struck by the way that he recognized them. They were saddened at his passing, but also overjoyed with the fact that he was being serene. He kept saying, be joyful, pray for me, pray with me, pray together. And so it was a bit of a roller coaster, as you say, but actually they all knew what was going to happen, and John Paul II had prepared them for this in his own way by suffering in public, putting his own declining state right out there for everyone to see. It's been unprecedented in the history of popes. The information that came out has been unprecedented in the history of the Vatican press office. There was a telling moment, though, when Joachim Navarro-Valls, his normally unflappable spokesman, announced really that the Pope was declining rapidly. He said, "I've never seen a moment like this in my 26 years here." And he almost cried, and that tells you just how deeply everyone was affected, Russ.
Alan Pizzi in Rome, thanks a lot. We'll talk to you in just a bit. Anthony?
It's the job of the College of Cardinals to choose the next pope. CBS News correspondent Richard Roth reports now on the rules and the rituals of selecting a successor, rules honed and shaped by centuries of history.
It will be the largest group of cardinals ever assembled to choose a new pope. Almost 200 princes of the church traveling to the Vatican from all its outposts around the world. Inside the Sistine Chapel, under the frescoes of Michelangelo, about 120 of them, cardinal electors, are eligible to vote. The rules go back more than 800 years. The first to receive a 2/3 majority gets the job. And once their conclave begins, the cardinals won't be seen until a new pope's been elected.
Conclave, from the Latin, means locked with a key, and that pretty much describes the isolation in which the cardinals will cast their ballots. They'll have no newspapers, radio, or TV, nor any phones, pagers, or email. The conclave will be locked away from outside contact, and the Sistine Chapel and Cardinals' dormitory will be electronically swept for listening devices.
It's secret. It's ultra, ultra, ultra secret, and there are no leaks.
Margaret Hebblethwaite writes on Vatican affairs.
I don't think there will be any leaks, and so we'll all be speculating without really knowing.
I think they're going to be looking for someone in their late 60s, early 70s. I don't think they'll elect another young man because that would mean another very long papacy, just like the one we just concluded.
Father Tom Rees is the author of Inside the Vatican.
There's no one who really stands out as the cardinal that everybody's talking about and that everybody wants to see elected. So it's going to be, I think, a very interesting conclave for that reason.
And with such a big group, geographically diverse, it could also be a long one. White smoke from the burning of ballots will be the signal a new pope's been elected.
Habemus Papam.
Habemus Papam, we have a pope. The election of Karol Wojtyła, Polish, not Italian, broke tradition. John Paul internationalized the papacy. The men picking his successor may think it's time to look closer to home. And among potential successors, there are several Italians. Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re is a powerful and respected Vatican insider.
If there is a leading Italian candidate, it's probably Cardinal Re.
And there's Cardinal Dionigi Tettamanzi, formerly Cardinal of Genoa. He was appointed to the Archdiocese of Milan by John Paul, an unusual move seen as a promotion for a man who shares many of John Paul's orthodox views.
Tettamanzi is the other Italian who I think has got a very good chance.
As Bishop of Rome, John Paul made this man his vicar, Cardinal Camillo Ruini, with responsibility for overseeing all the churches of Rome.
So he was clearly someone who had the trust and confidence of John Paul II.
Church experts think the man who follows in John Paul's footsteps probably won't come from Eastern Europe, though Austrian Cardinal Christoph Schönborn does have Slavic roots and is still considered a contender.
If there is one safe prediction, it's probably this: the next pope won't be from the United States. Call it the stigma of the superpower, but the fact is America's commanding role in the world probably makes it impossible for an American cardinal to win election here.
If an American got elected, a lot of third world agitators would say, oh yeah, the CIA fixed the election, or Wall Street bought the election.
And the taint of child abuse in the priesthood no doubt tips the scales more against any U.S. candidate. But the church could look to South America, where almost a fifth of the voting cardinals live. Colombia's Dario Castrillon Hoyos is a possible contender, and so is Honduras Archbishop Oscar Rodriguez Maradiaga.
In the 2001 consistory, Oscar Rodriguez of Honduras was made a cardinal. And within a few days, the news had gone around the world that this could be a future pope.
And for the first time, there's talk of a pope from Africa.
We could even see a cardinal elected from the third world.
a man of color as the Pope.
And do introduce yourself briefly.
Cardinal Francis Arinze is the man they talk about. The son of a Nigerian tribal chief, he converted to Catholicism as a boy. It is a political event here because in the election of a new pope, there'll be coalitions built, and every cardinal's a potential candidate. But as they vote, what will decide this contest, according to church teaching, is divine inspiration.
Correspondent Richard Roth. Joining us now is John Peter Pham. He's the author of a book on the history of the papacy. It's called Heirs of the Fishermen. He's also a CBS News consultant and a man who knows quite a bit about issues of papal succession. Professor Pham, thanks for coming in this morning. We appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
Let's talk about the succession process here. Is this something that has changed at all over the years, or are things pretty much the same way they've always been?
Well, since the 12th century, the voting for the Bishop of Rome has been limited to the members of the College of Cardinals. So that remains unchanged in the 1996 legislation that Pope John Paul II passed. He's tweaked the rules a little bit, but essentially it's a process that's gone on now for almost 1,000 years.
Professor, let me ask you, I mean, like Americans would probably equate this to a president appointing members of the Supreme Court. In many cases, those members share the president's ideology. When a pope appoints cardinals, is there a test that most popes have?
Well, certainly, I think, first and foremost, popes will look for men of faith who share that basic doctrinal position. On the other hand, although John Paul has appointed 114 of the 117 cardinals who are now eligible to participate in the conclave, we have to remember that once a pope is deceased, the cardinals are really free to pick and choose as they wish. And then after that, the man ultimately elected is vested by the very nature of the Constitution of the Catholic Church with absolute supreme power. So once a man is elected sovereign pontiff, as his title has it, all bets are off.
In history, have popes, of course, while they are alive, tried to influence who the next pope is going to be?
Certainly, even in the 20th century, in the 1930s, for example, Pope Pius XI made it very clear that his Secretary of State, Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, was a favorite. He even told a group of 5 cardinals once, "Sarà un bel papa," he'll make a great pope. And surely enough, in 1939, they elected Cardinal Pacelli as Pope Pius XII.
Richard Roth just had a piece on who the next pope could be. Let me ask you, sir, as someone who follows this, who could the successor to Pope John Paul II be?
Well, Russ, first and foremost, I'd say the successor to John Paul will have extraordinarily large shoes to fill. John Paul was a great human being, a great son of the church, a great figure in human history as well as church history. So he's going to have an awesome responsibility to fill, not just as Pope, but as successor to John Paul. And so he's going to have to fill certain qualities that John Paul had that perhaps some of his predecessors didn't have. A great charisma, a sense of dealing with great audiences, reaching out to millions, languages, communication. So really, I narrow the field down to maybe about 5 or 6, some of whom you've already mentioned in the earlier piece.
Let me ask you, in your opinion, how likely is it that we're going to see the first pope from the Third World?
Well, it's more likely now than ever before in the past. For the first time in the history of the Catholic Church, a majority of the members of the College of Cardinals come from developing countries in the global south. So certainly, at the very least, their concerns, their priorities will certainly be brought to the fore in this conclave and considered, and a very strong possibility that the next pope may emerge from that group of cardinals.
Author John Peter Pham joining us from Washington, D.C. Fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Anthony?
For Roman Catholics throughout America, today is dawning as the most poignant of Sunday mornings. Trish Regan is with us live here in New York. Good morning, Trish.
Good morning, Anthony. People are beginning to arrive here at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York for the morning mass. Last night, Catholic New Yorkers stood in line in heavy rains, waiting for the chance to go inside the church and say goodbye to their spiritual leader.
We walk by faith and not by sight.
Catholic New Yorkers were united in prayer last night, remembering the life of Pope John Paul II. Edward Cardinal Egan led the Mass.
We have lost a great and courageous man,
a devoted and dedicated priest, a wise and holy pontiff.
For many, the loss is intensely personal. Mia Lancaster said the Pope always reminded her of her grandfather.
My grandfather and I had such long, heartfelt discussions about the Pope even back then. And I mean, he was there for us for 26 and a half years. It's very hard to move on. It's very difficult.
Young people also came to pray last night, like 19-year-old Dan Kasaki.
What is it about him that was so appealing to younger people like yourself?
I think in a lot of ways it was his energy and his zeal for the church itself.
Teresa Ginsburg was in the church when she heard the news of the Pope's death.
I just, will miss him. I didn't agree with everything that he stood for, but I just, love the fact that he stood for peace.
Although for some the Pope was uncompromising in his beliefs, Cardinal Egan reminded parishioners that he had a tremendous ability to forgive, even forgiving the man who shot him in 1981.
The day after his operation in the Clinica Gemelli, I pray for that brother of mine who shot me, and I have sincerely forgiven.
The question now on many Catholics' minds?
Who's going to replace him? Even those of us who did not go to church every week, still, he was there as a rock of Gibraltar.
Masses will be held throughout the day here at St. Patrick's Cathedral, including a special Mass in the Pope's native Polish, as well as one that will be celebrated by New York's Cardinal Egan. Anthony?
And Tricia, I imagine you've got quite a turnout of people showing up there today.
Absolutely. A large turnout is expected, and if last night is any indication, the turnout will be quite large indeed. In fact, it was standing room only in the church last night.
Trish Regan at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Thanks very much. The American flock Pope John Paul II tried to lead was, in fact, a loose coalition of many flocks with many diverse concerns and interests. Mika Brzezinski takes a sounding of views about the Pope among a cross-section of American Catholic women.
Christine Schoener and Catherine Barberia are mothers now, with children to raise and houses to run. But they remember a time when they were idealistic teenagers and Pope John Paul II first visited the United States.
He touched people because he was visible. He was having fun and enjoying it, and all the children around were really into this.
The Pope was young and vigorous in 1979. His tours resembled those of rock stars.
His face was lit up. He was so excited and so warm that even though there were so many people, you really felt a connection.
That connection with the Pope and with the Catholic Church has become harder to maintain as these women, like millions of others, struggle today with the question of what it means to be a modern American Catholic. They are the ones who make sure that their children go to church and get religious instruction.
So you ladies are the religious forces in the household?
I guess so. Yes.
Women are the driving force in the Catholic Church today. In addition to filling the pews, they run the parishes and organize most of the charitable and social activities of the church.
Women have always done the lion's share of unpaid labor for the church, and John Paul II has ratcheted things up a bit by saying to all the bishops and priests in the world, acknowledge the role of women and bring women more and more into the roles that they can fulfill.
But this Pope has been clear about the limits to the roles that women can play in the church, even as they move into management and decision-making jobs in other parts of society.
It's a shame to say that if somebody felt so connected to God in their heart, that just because someone is born a woman, it changes the course of things that you can do in not the community part of the church, but the church as an organization.
And since ordination to the priesthood remains kind of the threshold for real decision-making power in the Catholic Church. I think, again, you see a tension between the two sides of his teaching, which will have to be dealt with in the future.
There are other challenges facing the American Catholic Church, the severe shortage of priests and the financial fallout from the sex abuse scandals.
First things first, pay the victims now.
The most critical may be the rise of the cafeteria Catholic, people who embrace the church rules that they accept and reject the ones they don't like.
The church asks a lot of its people. It has some strong views, and a lot of people, I would venture to say, many in the younger generation, feel that those views equal intolerance. How do you bridge that?
That is those strict rules are goals that you may aspire to, but it's very hard to be that way in all instances. And I think you do your best, but you love God and you believe in God and you do what you think is right.
So they strive to live a moral and tolerant life and hope the church keeps pace with them.
The church needs to find a way to become more, I don't know if attractive is the right word, to the younger people, because I think they have too many outside interests that take them away from morals and things like that.
But that's unlikely to happen anytime soon. Pope John Paul II has made sure that his conservative beliefs will be in force long after his death.
There is not a single archbishop that hasn't been named by this pope.
So how will Pope John Paul II be remembered by American Catholics? As the strict and stoic keeper of the old faith? Or as the strong and charismatic leader who inspired the young to renew their faith?
He tried to speak to individual people. He tried to portray himself as somebody you could somewhat relate to, and that he cared for everybody, and he truly was holy.
Correspondent Mika Brzezinski. We're joined again by Father Michael Russo. Father Russo, it's interesting what we hear American Catholics saying here, particularly women. A lot of people in the Catholic Church loved and respected this Pope, but they also disagreed with him.
Well, he has energized the conservative base of the Church. We have to energize the centrist and the rest of the Church. I mean, it's crucial. I'm in a parish in California, one of the most gifted parishes in the country. Laymen and women run that church in every capacity. Right. From administering the money to administering communion. And make no mistake about it, these people want to be energized, want to serve one another in the world. So the next Pope is going to have to think this out. You know, how do we get people involved? How do we continue to bring people out and serve the work of the Church?
Well, how likely is it that the next Pope will be more progressive on issues involving the Church?
Progressive? I think these grace moments again. I mean, there are ways of telling people how they can minister and serve. And it all comes to heart, person to person, and good modeling, and what's best practice. This country is very important to the educational ministry, to parish ministry, and we can make a big difference in the church in this country and around the world.
This Pope had an enormous amount of charisma. It had a real integrity to it. It wasn't just star power, but he had an enormous amount of charisma. Does the next Pope need to have that as well?
I don't think so. I think we can take a little bit of a step backward even. I think we need someone who could pay attention to the details of how this church works. I think the bishops, the archbishops, the laity, the priests, the religious, the sisters, need to know they have a very important role to play in continuing that ministry of Christ. You're not going to repeat a John Paul II. I think the person who comes into office has to be an authentic person, an authentic pastor who can bring that charism to the world.
I guess it would be a mistake for the next person to try to emulate Pope John Paul II.
You have to be true to yourself.
Sure, yeah, but I would think that would be, with some folks, that could possibly be a real attractive thing to try to do that.
Sure. I have taken a look at some of these candidates. There are a few that can do that.
Okay. Father Michael Russo, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
You're watching CBS News' continuing coverage of the death of Pope John Paul II.
And we are joined right now by Monsignor Brian Firm. He is the Dean of Canon Law at Catholic University in Washington. He had a personal relationship with the late Pope. Monsignor, good morning to you.
Good morning.
We've been talking about the man a lot for the last 24 hours. What can you tell us about Pope John Paul, the man?
I've had the opportunity a number of times to have met him and actually dine with him on a number of occasions. He was a most extraordinarily warm person, very human and very welcoming, an absolutely marvelous individual.
Do you have a favorite story that you'd like to share with us this morning?
I think one of the nice stories was many years ago when I was a very young priest in 1980. I was in Rome and there was the custom of celebrating Mass with the Pope, and a number of us celebrated it. And quite unexpectedly, he invited us back to breakfast afterwards. And that was just a marvelous experience and a very good breakfast.
Monsignor, as we are speaking right now, we're looking at pictures of the Swiss Guard paying homage to the Pope. Monsignor, I know that one thing a lot of people don't know about this Pope is that he valued downtime. Could you kind of go into that for us? What was that like with him?
Well, I think that in fact he thoroughly enjoyed being with people and enjoyed the company of people. And the downtime especially, I suspect, comes from the period before he was a priest and even when he was a priest in Poland. He was a great athlete, enjoyed, in fact was often known as God's athlete, and thoroughly enjoyed that sort of downtime. And in fact he established, people forget this, he organized almost immediately after his election the building of a swimming pool at his summer retreat at Castel Gandolfo. And he also thoroughly enjoyed walking in the Italian Alps, and also was a great intellect in reading, so he very much enjoyed downtime.
Yeah, some of the other things he liked to do, I know he liked to write poetry. He was also an actor. In fact, I'm told he wanted to be an actor when he was a young man. Did he have a sense of humor? How would you describe that?
Oh, he had an enormous sense of humor. In the times that I met him, certainly. And in fact, you can see that in his connection with people in vast crowds. When he first came to the United States in, I think it was Madison Square Garden, with the youth of America, then he was able to laugh with them and stir them up a bit, pull their legs and so on. He had a tremendous sense of humor, yes.
To folks at home, I want to give you an idea of what you're seeing on the air right now. That is Pope John Paul II lying in repose in the Vatican. Monsignor, when we talk about successors to this Pope, what do you think the electors will be looking for?
Well, I certainly think they'll be looking for someone who will continue and build upon what Pope John Paul has done over the last 26 or 27 years. But I also think they'll be looking for someone who will be able to meet the challenges of the Church in the immediate future. And thirdly, I don't think they're going to necessarily try to produce another John Paul II. That would be rather foolhardy and probably impossible.
This Pope was 58 years old when he was elected to the papacy. Do you think the next Pope will be a young man, or do you think the electors will be looking for someone older?
I think it'll probably be in the middle, where there's an old Latin saying, in media stat vitus, you find strength in the middle. That is, I suspect someone probably in their late 60s, around 70, someone not necessarily who will have a long pontificate. And often, as is been already pointed out, the popes oscillate between someone of a long pontificate and those of a shorter pontificate.
Okay. Monsignor Brian Firm, the Dean of Canon Law at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. We thank you so much for getting up on this Sunday morning and joining us.
Thank you.
You take care, sir. And CBS News coverage of the death of Pope John Paul II continues.
watching CBS News' continuing coverage of the death of Pope John Paul II. I'm Anthony Mason in New York. Good morning. On this day after the death of the leader of the world's 1 billion Catholics, the Vatican is both heavy with sorrow and busy with the hallowed procedures of change. We go back to John Roberts in Rome. Good morning again, John.
Good morning to you, Anthony. The word that we got on the death of Pope John Paul II from Vatican officials who were with him in his final hours was that the Pope was at peace, that he was serene, that he had come to the acceptance that his time on earth had come to an end. And to the end, he remained a Pope of the people, particularly to the thousands of young people who had gathered in St. Peter's Square to pray for his soul. It's difficult to ascertain exactly what the Pope said yesterday. I mean, he's a man who could barely say hello in his final hours. But according to his spokesman, the Pope heard the noise of the young people in the crowd at St. Peter's Square and delivered a message to them to say, "I wanted to come to you, but you have come to me, and I thank you." And according to Vatican officials who were with him in his final seconds as he knew that the Lord was about to take him away, Pope John Paul II made an extraordinary effort to speak one last word. He spoke the word "Amen" and then faded away. The last images of Pope John Paul II stand in sharp contrast with the vigorous, world globe-trotting pastor that Catholic faithful had come to know, a man who visited some 129 countries around the world and got very personally involved in delivering sacraments to the people. His last public appearance on Wednesday at the window of his apartment showed that he was struggling. I mean, his health had declined to the point where it looked like he could barely communicate at all, and that had to be frustrating for a man who had made communication his lifestyle. But I have to tell you that the lasting image of the Pope for the billion or more Catholics around the world will not be of the infirmity and not be of the head of the Catholic Church, but of the universal pastor who made the world his parish. Anthony?
John, is Rome a city essentially in mourning in toto today? I mean, I know they canceled sporting matches in Italy over the weekend. Give me a sense of the place at the moment, if you can.
Well, we have talked, Anthony, about the 9 official days of mourning that the Vatican has declared. Italy has declared 3 days of official mourning as well, in addition to the sporting events being canceled. There's not a whole lot of activity here. What you see on the streets mostly are the thousands of people streaming to St. Peter's Square to celebrate Mass earlier today, to stand around the square. It's become as much of an event as it has been a place to pay last respects to the Pope. This definitely is the center of Rome today, and will be for some time until the Pope is laid to rest. That would probably be sometime between Wednesday and Friday, Anthony.
John Roberts in Rome, thanks very much. The Vatican has now formally released the cause of death for the Pope. It is septic shock. The announcement of Pope John Paul's death shattered the tranquility of America's Saturday afternoon, but the Vatican procedure that led up to it is steeped in tradition. When the Pope dies, papal officials traditionally certify his death in the Apostolic Palace in the third-floor papal apartments. There, the Pope's fisherman's ring is broken, his papal seal scored or canceled, and his body prepared, dressed in pontifical vestments. The Pope's study and bedroom are sealed, and his body is later moved to lie in state near the altar inside St. Peter's Basilica. Our last views of John Paul II were of a very old man, largely incapacitated by disease. But in the case of this Pope, it was the last impressions that were deceiving. Mark Phillips puts things into perspective.
In the latter stages of his life, Pope John Paul II had a line he'd use when asked how he was. From the neck up, okay, he'd say. From the neck down, not so good. Toward the end, a papacy once renowned for its energy had settled into a sad silence. But even in his frail final years, there were still some glimpses of the man who had been known as God's politician. This was a pope of almost unnatural vitality and an intellectual energy that endured through a physical decline that lasted for more than 2 decades. A decline that many think began with the almost successful attempt on his life in St. Peter's Square in 1981. It seems a very long time ago, that he had displayed such unprecedented energy and traveled like no other pope before him, bringing his message of social progress combined with religious conservatism to where he thought it was needed most: Africa, Latin America, Asia, and finally, the Middle East.
The first trip he made to the United States was in '79, in the autumn of '79. He shocked a few people by spelling out his teaching on all the major issues, from abortion to divorce to extramarital sex, all that. Very, very conventional.
His approach to politics, though, arguably bordered on the revolutionary. Not without his support could the Polish Solidarity movement have succeeded. And not without solidarity could the rest of the communist monolith in Eastern Europe have fallen. He never took credit, though. The tree of communism was rotten, he once said. I just shook it. Yet, as he took an interest in European politics, he forbade priests in Latin America from engaging in what came to be known as liberation theology there. A pope of paradox and apparent contradiction, capable of extreme relevance and of staggering detachment, never more so than in his attitude toward women, whether it was the question of women priests or over the issue of contraception or abortion. This pope had a one-word answer: no. Yet despite his stern, often ignored message, this was a pope with a rock star-like appeal, proved again at this 1993 youth rally in Denver. And if people found an inconsistency in his championing of political freedom while adhering to strict church doctrine, then they didn't understand this pope. His rejection of communism, like his rejection of third world exploitation or of Western consumerism, was all based on his view of human rights and the value of the human person.
The right to life itself.
As George W. Bush discovered, John Paul II was not reluctant to lecture visiting American presidents on the death penalty or human embryo research. And if his views clashed with modern trends and created the American cafeteria Catholic, who picks and chooses which rules to follow, then history and a higher authority will judge who was right and who was wrong. Pope John Paul II's epitaph, like his papacy, will inspire great debate. But all will surely agree that the man called Wojtyła emerged from the clerical obscurity of Krakow to become more than a pope, to become, for more than a quarter century, an international superstar with an influence that went well beyond religion and which helped shape some of the momentous events of our time. After several years of following the Pope, particularly around Eastern Europe and into the areas where he enjoyed spectacular popularity in places like Latin America, I have to say that until you've actually stood in a field with this man amongst millions of people and heard that roar of adulation go up, it's like nothing that anybody in this business ever experiences. Anthony.
Mark, I mean, you talk about the contradictions of the man and his principles to some degree. I mean, even here in America, he was revered, he was loved, but a lot of people didn't like what he had to say sometimes. How do you explain? How do you explain the extent of his appeal, despite the fact they didn't always like the message?
I think there's a contradiction between loving the man and necessarily listening to what he has to say, or has had to say. In all of the central tenets of his teaching, whether that's had to do with contraception, with divorce, with the role of women in the priesthood, with the role of priests in political society, with homosexuality, all of these kinds of teachings, as has been said over and over in the last days since the Pope has passed on, his teachings were extremely conservative. And the effect of that has been, well, there has been this wonderful adulation for the man. In fact, particularly in the West, there has been a decline in adherence to the teachings of the Catholic Church, certainly a decline in many of the countries in Western and Southern Europe, where Catholicism is effectively the state religion, Italy, Spain, France, that kind of thing. A massive decline in attendance at church, a massive decline in enrollment at seminaries, in all of those places. How do you explain it? I think right now is the time when the analysis will start to take place. He may be, in some respects, the most controversial pope, certainly an extraordinary papacy, but the most controversial pope in some time, one who was loved, but as I say, not necessarily listened to.
Mark Phillips coming from London today. Thanks, Mark. During his visits to the United States, Pope John Paul usually stuck with the big cities, the big venues where he drew huge crowds, but not always. Bob McNamara tells us about one small-town church where the Pope's visit decades ago seems like it was just yesterday.
He was just a man, but like magic, everywhere Pope John Paul II traveled in this country, in the streets, in the stadiums, crowds were in the hundreds of thousands. In 5 American visits over 2 decades, Pope John Paul saw 20 cities and 4 presidents. Most people would catch just a fleeting glimpse of the man, but many would be forever touched.
I never get this close to the Pope.
He's a tremendous personality, and he has that magnetism that you just don't find anywhere else.
But for all of the clamor, all of the massive crowds, some of the most lasting memories of John Paul II were made more than 2 decades ago in the smallest of places. Tiny St. Patrick's Catholic Church, deep in the heart of Iowa.
He came in the church and, he kind of gave me a hug and asked me if I was Irish.
What'd you tell him?
I told him I didn't know.
Bob Mulvihill Jr. was 9, an altar boy, the day Pope John Paul came to St. Patrick's in 1979 for a prayer service. He had come here after an Iowa farmer wrote the Pope, inviting him to meet rural America face to face. As the Pope walked down the aisle, Jennifer Mulvihill touched his hand.
It's a keychain and it's pure gold.
It is. And a gift from the Pope
It has a Pope on it.
she still treasures.
Really exciting?
Mm-hmm. It was nice to meet him.
He was so normal, for being so important that it made me proud now to be Catholic and to be part of the church and part of the Irish settlement, and that's something that'll never be taken away from me, is that memory and the pride of being there.
He spent only an hour at this little country church, but the Pope seemed almost reluctant to leave.
I don't think I've ever been so excited, or it's just been a wonderful time.
It was a validating moment because he came here and he said, you're a rural community, you are stewards of the land, you do what you do because you love what you do.
Very nice.
And you're doing a good job.
But the small family farm that was the Mulvihills' life then would be lost, like thousands of others, to the farm financial crisis of the 1980s. And yet the faith they practiced the day the Pope visited is the same.
I don't know that we've lived our lives any different because of it, but I think we certainly appreciate how special it was.
From his first visit to this country to the fragile figure he was on his last trip here, all the pageantry and choreography of each papal event could never camouflage the fact that the Roman Catholic Church's holiest man was most of all a humble man. Bob McNamara, CBS News, Cumming, Iowa.
A few cities in America are feeling the loss of Pope John Paul II more deeply than Boston. It's a city with very deep Catholic roots, along with some scarring recent experiences. Sharon Alfonsi joins us now with that in Boston. Sharon, good morning.
Good morning, Russ. Well, 25 years ago, millions of Bostonians braved a driving rain to meet a newly elected pope. Well, this morning, on this rainy Sunday morning, thousands flocked to Mass again, this time to say goodbye.
And now let us pray for the following words of our Savior God. Our Father, who art in heaven.
One of America's most Catholic cities is grieving. Even finding comfort in tradition is hard.
When I got to the part of the canon where we pray for the Pope, and there's no Pope, I kind of stopped, and it was a feeling of being an orphan for a moment.
Pope John Paul II holds a special place in the city's history and hearts.
The Pope has been the Pope for me my whole adult life. It's like losing a parent, and it just brings back all those memories.
Memories that many here will never forget. In 1979, shortly after he was elected, the pontiff made his first visit to America. The first stop, Boston. 2 million Bostonians lined the streets and crowded onto a rain-drenched common to see and hear the church's new leader.
In today's society,
a young pope warmed the crowd with his words, telling them the Pope is your friend. It was a friendship that would survive even the most turbulent of times.
Guilty offenses charged indecent assault and battery on a child.
As the sex scandal unfolded in Boston, Pope John Paul II stood watch from Rome, ultimately overseeing the resignation of an embattled cardinal.
I don't think the Pope's image was tarnished as much as Cardinal Law's image was definitely tarnished. There's still a fair amount of distrust.
The body of Christ.
Now, the same pews that emptied when Catholics lost faith in the institution are filled with those who never lost faith in its leader.
It's like losing a member of family. It's tough to me.
You said it's like losing a father.
It is losing your father.
The landscape of the church here in Boston has certainly changed since the Pope's visit 25 years ago, but many Bostonians say their fondness for the Pope never faded. Russ?
Sharon Alfonsi in Boston, thanks a lot. For more on Pope John Paul's impact on American Catholics, we are joined once again by Father Michael Russo, the professor of communications at St. Mary's College of California. Father, good morning again to you.
Good morning again.
What did Pope John Paul II think about America and Americans?
Well, of course, he didn't come from a Democratic background. You know, this is the one thing I think we as Democrats, know that we elect our leaders. I think for him to adjust to this society where we elect representatives and believe in democracy, it's a different experience. He certainly kind of got involved in a very deep way with our need for community, I think. I mean, I think when we were listening to Mark Phillips, it brought me back to 1987, where in one day we went from a huge rally in Los Angeles with energized young people to Carmel, California. We landed in Monterey. He shook the hand of Clint Eastwood, who was the mayor of Carmel at the time. And then later on in that day, went to Mission de Dolores in San Francisco, where he embraced a young boy who had AIDS. It was a remarkable day. But all of this is tied to community. We need community in this country more than ever. When we look at our high schools, we look at our colleges, we look at our kids, we want to have them grow up in a place where they know their neighbors and they can walk down the street safely. And I think that's all part of church and community.
He was at times, I mean, as much as he came to America, and I think he made 5 trips here, 7 stops, so we saw more of the Pope than we'd ever seen. But a lot of times he was very critical of us, wasn't he?
Sure, he was. I remember that one meeting in Los Angeles where he brought in all the bishops, and it was kind of a closed-door meeting, and we were all kind of waiting outside. What did he tell them, And we look back at that, and we realized that John Paul, as an individual, had great affection for us, but also could be critical of us. And particularly, as we know now, of course, his strong stand with regard to abortion and the life issues. He certainly energized that group in this country and around the world on those issues. Everything from the death penalty through abortion.
I think when some Americans think of Catholics, they think of Notre Dame.
Absolutely.
the Kennedys. But how would you describe the typical worldwide Catholic as far as demographics are concerned?
It's as diverse as you can imagine. I mean, and when we see these cardinals coming and walking down next week, or even today when you watch the Mass from Rome, and you look at their complexions, you realize that in many ways, this internationalization of the Curia, and certainly the cardinals themselves, represent these various countries and cultures.
Father Michael Russo, thanks very much. President Bush was quick to react to the death of Pope John Paul II yesterday, calling him a hero for the ages. White House correspondent Bill Plant joins us now for more on the president and his plans. Good morning, Bill.
Good morning to you, Anthony. The president at this hour is in church at the Protestant church just across the square here from the White House, St. John's, the church he usually attends when he's here in Washington. But yesterday, shortly after the Pope died, about 90 minutes after the Pope died, Mr. Bush appeared in the cross hall of the White House to make a statement to the nation, to let them know how much he felt the world would miss John Paul II. And shortly after that, Mr. Bush and the First Lady attended a Mass at St. Matthew's Catholic Cathedral here in Washington last evening. No surprise there, the president is expected to go to Rome later this week There's been no official announcement of that yet because, of course, there's protocol to be observed and the formal invitation has to be extended, but we know that the White House has always planned to have him go. Now, Mr. Bush will be the first sitting president to go to a papal funeral. But when you look at it, that's not really all that unusual, given two things. This president really did admire and respect this Pope. He said after one of his meetings, the second one I think it was, he said, "This is the president talking. I'm not poetic enough to describe what it's like in his presence." And the other reason, of course, is the political reason. Mr. Bush has always tried to reach out to people of faith, and he tried to reach out particularly to Catholics in the last election, and I think that continues as the Republicans try to broaden their base. But politics aside, there's no question that George W. Bush really did admire and respect John Paul, even though they had some differences. They were, of course, together on the issues that the church refers to as culture of life issues, the opposition to abortion, stem cell research, things like that. However, the Pope, as you'll remember, opposed the war in Iraq. And we are told by very good sources that when they last met, last June, the president really got an earful from the Pope on the war and on the Pope's opposition to the war. It was, of course, done in a diplomatic and pleasant way, but it was done nonetheless. Flags here at half-staff all throughout the nation's capital, all federal buildings, in fact, until the Pope is buried. And the president joining the rest of the nation in mourning John Paul II. Anthony?
Bill, back to this question of the war, which, I mean, for much of his administration, the president has been a war president. And on the principal issue, you have the Pope vocally opposing him. I mean, it's surprising. This is a Pope who people seem to admire despite the fact that he was very often at odds with their own beliefs.
Well, you know, he was referred to earlier in our broadcast as God's politician. And that's probably the most apt phrase that you can think of to describe this Pope. Mm-hmm. Think about it. He and the president got along on some very key issues, key to the Pope and key to the president. So there was obviously room for disagreement. And the Pope obviously, as a moral leader, was in a position to speak to the leaders of nations to tell them what he thought. And this president listened.
He was, Bill, the Pope was, as you mentioned, not just a religious figure, he was a political figure who all of the world's leaders, like President Bush, had to deal with, didn't they?
That's right. He is a head of state. The Vatican, of course, is a sovereign nation, has been since the earlier part of the last century. And popes throughout history have wielded power both temporal and spiritual. And it's the temporal power that, of course, has been a source of friction between the church and the rest of the world. But this Pope handled that very differently, as you can see in his relations with the politicians of the world.
Bill Plant at the White House this morning. Thank you very much. You're watching continuing coverage of the death of Pope John Paul II here on CBS News. I'm joined again by Russ Mitchell. This is the thing we keep hearing this morning. The admiration for this man around the world is just extraordinary. Mm-hmm. And yet, I mean, it seems to be that people admire his integrity, his honesty, his frankness, and his conviction.
Yes, it's interesting. And I wonder, piggybacking what Bill said, what it must be like to get an earful from the Pope. I mean, how do you respond to that? But earlier we were talking with Father Michael Russo, who talked about the Pope's trip to California a few years ago. And one of the things I remember about that trip, and I was working in St. Louis and covering the story, he met with Hollywood leaders. Hollywood movers and shakers, mm-hmm. and tried to get them to somewhat tone down some of the things that were going on in Hollywood. And I just found that extraordinary, that a Pope would visit folks like that and try to make his point. I'm not sure it did much good, but it was an interesting trip, an interesting pitch.
It's so much of, I mean, I wonder what the Pope's influence would have been had his political role not been so significant right at the outset, because right after he assumed the papacy, you had the beginning of the unraveling of communism, and his role was so huge, and that made him a political figure and gave him the sense that he could make things change.
Right. One of the pieces we saw this morning said that one of the biggest mistakes of communism in the past few years was to let Pope John Paul mm-hmm. come to Poland. Mm-hmm. and address the crowd, because that was the turning point.
All right. You're watching CBS News continuing coverage of the death of Pope John Paul II. Joining us now from Washington is Bob Schieffer, who'll be back later this morning with a special edition of Face the Nation. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning, Anthony.
What are your impressions of this Pope?
Well, this Pope was one of the great figures of the 20th century. I don't think there's any getting around that. And I was listening to you talking with Bill Plant just a while ago about the part he played in politics. This Pope was a politician, as all great leaders have to be, whether in religion, whether in government. Politics plays a part. I think of the Pope in the same way I think of Ronald Reagan, in that he knew that when you're communicating with people, it has to be more than just the words you say. It's just as important where you say them, how you say them. Ronald Reagan once said that most people don't see themselves except in the mirror when they shave each morning. But he said as an actor, he came to understand there is a wide shot. People see you from afar. People see you from behind. The way you walk, the way you carry yourself has as much to do with communicating as the words you speak. And that was very much the case with this Pope. This was a man of great conviction, but he knew that he had to demonstrate his convictions and not just say them. And so when he became Pope, the first thing he did, he went back to Poland, because he knew that in itself was communicating with the Polish people. And he told them when he got there, don't crawl on your belly, stand up, you're men. And they stood up, and that was the beginning of Poland throwing off the shackles of communism. This man was a great enemy of communism, perhaps its greatest enemy, and along with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, had so much to do with bringing down communism. I think the thing that we have to remember about this Pope, Anthony, is the way he lived his convictions. He went to Poland, he talked of courage. When he was shot, he later went to his assassin's cell and asked his forgiveness. This Pope showed us how to live. He also, in these final days, it seems to me, showed us with great dignity how to die. This is going to be a man who will be remembered as not just a great religious leader, but as one of the great leaders, it seems to me, of the last half of the 20th century.
Bob, we've talked a lot about his role in the communist world and his role in bringing down communism, which was widely acknowledged. But he also was a very significant presence in the Middle East and in Israel, was he not?
Oh, yes. And of course, he was the one who offered the prayer and said, asked for forgiveness for the persecution of the Jews. He went to the Wailing Wall at one point and offered a prayer and did not invoke the name of Jesus, the first time a Christian leader had done that. This was a man of great tolerance as well as being a man of great conviction.
Bob, you talked about him being a political figure as well as a religious figure. I mean, how much of that, I was talking with Russ about this before, how much of that do you think came from the role he had immediately in Poland and in fighting with communism? I mean, would his significance have been somewhat less if he had not been such a pivotal figure there?
Well, I suppose we're all a product of our environment and the things around us. Remember that this man, before he came of age in a time of communism, he had suffered under the Nazi boot. So he knew fascism and he knew communism. He was a man who had a great belief in the human spirit and a great belief, therefore, in freedom. And I think that had so much to do with the person that he became. This was a great man.
You think anyone can fill his shoes, Bob?
Well, certainly, as de Gaulle said, the cemeteries are filled with, you know, the graves of indispensable men. Someone will come along, as someone always does. But that does not diminish in any way the contribution that this man made, it seems to me, not just to his church and as a leader of his church, but to the whole cause of freedom.
Yeah, it was Stalin who made light of the power of the Pope once to the French foreign minister, saying, the Pope, how many divisions does he have? Well, as it turns out,
found out,
this
didn't
Pope,
he?
yeah, he did. He didn't need divisions. He had a lot of power. Bob Schieffer in Washington, thanks. You're watching CBS News' continuing coverage of the death of Pope John Paul II. You're watching CBS News' continuing coverage of the death of Pope John Paul II. I'm Anthony Mason in New York. Roman Catholics around the world and here in America are reflecting this morning on Pope John Paul II's life and works, as are many non-Catholics as well. At the Vatican, the preparation for the Church's next era are already underway. We go back again to John Roberts in Rome for the very latest. Good morning again, John.
And good afternoon to you, Anthony, from the Eternal City. Not much more is going to happen today by way of church business. Pope John Paul II is lying in repose in the Sala Clementina in the Apostolic Palace where he lived. Invited guests are being invited to come by and personally pay their last respects. The body will then be taken away, prepared for burial, and Pope John Paul II will officially lie in state sometime after noon tomorrow in St. Peter's Basilica. According to his orders, the papal bedroom and his study have been sealed by his camerlengo or chamberlain, but the rest of his apartment has been left open for several other staff who live and work there. But upon his burial, which will occur sometime between Wednesday and Friday, his entire apartment will be sealed, his personal effects boxed up and taken away in preparation for the next pope to occupy that apartment. You know, Anthony, there are so many fascinating things that surround the tradition of papal succession and as well papal burial. For example, Pope John Paul II will be buried not in one, but three caskets, one made of cypress wood put inside one made of lead with its lid welded shut, and then a simple pine box which will go into the ground. Anthony?
John Roberts at the Vatican. Thanks. Millions of Americans have known only this one pope and have never before witnessed the rituals of a papal